think we're good. My internet is terrible. I don't know what's going on. I need to call Virgin. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
I thought it'd be good to have like a follow-up discussion from the podcast episode that we had recently with JJ Bola, which I think was awesome. It was really good. It brought up a lot of interesting thoughts. Can you not hear me?
No, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So part of what I wanted to talk about, and I've been having really interesting thoughts. What provoked it most recently was the England match, and so
Mm-hmm.
the players did the whole kneeling for Black Lives Matter or whatever, and to protest against racism, and people started booing. And then there's all this back and forth in the media about whether they were right to be kneeling or not. So I guess it's just brought to the forefront the hypocrisy in that there's a lot of England fans that want England to do well. Obviously, they want all these young boys not to play for Nigeria or Ivory Coast or wherever their native country is. They want them to play for England, so they want England to win, go and win the Euros. But then simultaneously, if these players want to say, "Okay, we're going to play," but please can people not be racist to us? Then
Mm-hmm.
suddenly that's an issue. So I think there's this natural hypocrisy there. And so I think it would be interesting to talk about. I'd be interested in your perspective, actually, and
Mm-hmm.
how you feel as I guess, a Black Brit. Do you identify more with Britishness or with something else?
Nah, that's so funny because I feel like when I was younger, I used to be more British than Black, emphasis on the British in Black because I went up to a comprehensive, predominantly white school, grew up in that area, and yeah, like I don't know, there was something about the way my parents used to talk about Nigeria that I didn't like. They would be like, "Oh, now you're Nigerian, all this and that," and me being a naive kid, I'd be like, "Nah, I'm British," like with the accent as well, so you can imagine. But like ever since like just growing older, I've had to reconcile and appreciate. Well, I've had the opportunity to reconcile and appreciate the part of me, the things that are part of me, um well, like unconsciously, that aren't really normal in the lives of people who are straight, who are just like 100% British, but then also the part of me that is just not normal with the people who are 100% Nigerian. And so I guess I'm a hybrid, I'm a fusion. I have Nigerian blood, but I've grown up in a British environment. And I suppose I feel like that's the best way I can describe it. Like ethnically, I am Nigerian, but I've spent my whole life here. That if I was to go back to Nigeria, I would get torn to shreds. I would not out like the culture there. Yeah, if I didn't have any money, if I was put on the
Mm,
street, gosh, nah, man.
that's fair.
I'm
I do
built to
get that.
survive
Have you
here.
been before?
Yeah, I've been back a couple times. Last time I went back was 2019, 2020. For
Okay.
Christmas. It's always amazing for Christmas, but that particular time I was like I spent half the time in bed because again, if you're not used to drinking water out there, yeah, it'll finish up your digestive system. So I guess in a way it's like the best way I can describe it is like, yeah, I've adapted to live. I'm a Nigerian who's adapted to live in the British climate.
Fair. And do you feel as though your Britishness is accepted here in the same way by, I guess, the general population, in the same way that maybe other Black people? Because I think the sentiment is similar for a lot of people, where a lot of people, particularly in the UK, which I think is different from the US, a lot of people are still maybe second or third generation. And so
Mm.
either themselves or their parents will have very strong memories of where they come from. They'll have a lot of this culture that they're bringing with them. And very
Mm.
often, when they move here, they're moving into communities that did I
It
just cut out?
froze up.
Not sure what happened sometimes. But yeah, all I was saying is that I think there's a lot of people that come here as immigrants and typically
Mhm.
go to lots of different things.
Man, it cut out. It cut off like half of that.
Really. Okay. The long story short is,
Yeah.
do you feel as though your identity or your Britishness, the one that you identify, is accepted by people generally? Like, do you feel as though other people would look at you and accept that you are also British?
Yeah, I guess like the generation that I'm part of, we're more accepting of it. And it's weird because I feel like with each generation that goes on, like that I don't know how to describe it. With each generation that passes, like the biases that people hold become more and more implicit. Like it was okay in the 1970s for people to say that they just straight up didn't like black people, but now people are so in track. Like no, let me not be like that. Let me not be academic. Sorry. So many people are so intolerant of black culture. And I won't say that that makes someone racist, but it's like the way that someone described. It's like when someone describes something in a way that that can't be right. That meme like that's gotta be racist. Like
Mm,
like some, and I feel like that's what has happened now. People won't straight up and say people won't straight up come and be like, yeah, nah, N word, whatever. Like, yeah, I hate you because of your skin color. But people will hate, so people will have a strong dislike for the manifestations of which your culture can take within society. And I find that quite ironic because there's certain things about black culture that people love, but they don't accept,
yeah.
they don't accept the producers for who they are.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's super interesting. I definitely get that. And that goes for the football that we were just talking about. It also goes for music. It also goes for even just words and bits of, I guess, like the Black British lexicon, which has
mm,
some bits of maybe it's patois or some West Indian with some bits
mm,
of African words and African culture as well. So it's a really
yeah,
interesting mix. And it's interesting how there's a lot of people that I guess like to flirt with it or enjoy being in and around that culture, even eating the food or whatever it is. But then at the
mm,
same time, aren't fully accepting of that. And also, I
mm,
think there's a lot of people that make a distinction between Black British people as, still reminding them that they're not from here. Obviously, that gets
mm.
enforced by people like Preeti Patel, who will just wake you up in the middle of the night and send you back to countries
Shouldn't be
you've never
laughing.
been to before. But
Yeah.
at the same time, there's also a lot of people, you get asked, oh, where are you from? Like, where are you really from? Regardless
Mm,
of whether or not you were born here. And there's this presupposition that you were possibly from elsewhere that you
mm,
wouldn't get. You don't necessarily automatically ask a white person if they're, unless they have an accent, if they are from
mm.
somewhere in Europe.
That's true, and it's becoming harder to distinguish because it's becoming hard to distinguish because people aren't just transforming like internally. So like being transformed by their environment, like me being Nigerian British. But if I was to, for example, I'm so sorry, mom. I just had to say that. For example, if I was to marry someone who was white or had a lighter pigmentation, then that's another way in which like the barriers the barriers become blurred. Um, and yeah, that's that's what I've kind of forgotten what the point that I was just saying. I was on a really good point, but I think that was the main part. That was the main part of it.
That's fair. Yeah, no, I do agree. I think I just find the dichotomy really interesting.
Mm,
Um, do you think that there is a super strong Black British identity? And I know that we say it, and I guess I do feel it to an extent, but then
mm,
also I still find that even when you look at conversations that people have maybe on social media, there's still very much kind of like a West Indian contingent. Even and this goes way back to, sorry, not just them, but also maybe like Nigerians or people from other African demographics as well. And I think it also goes back to even when people from those groups emigrated here in the first place. You had West Indians who I think were among the first ones here. They had their communities and their cultures and things kind of first, and began kind of curating the Black British experience. And then you had lots of people coming from West Africa. And then beyond that, you've had people come from East Africa, other parts of the Black diaspora. And so it's interesting that I guess the Black British experience has become like a mixing pot of all of that. But I'm interested to know whether you feel like it is now its own unique thing, as opposed to just the collective phrase that we use to say maybe Jamaican British or Nigerian British or Ghanaian British or Congolese British, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I see. Yeah, I see your point. I feel like I understand the point that you're trying to make, in the sense that we're not just looking at ethnicity versus ethnicity, but we're looking at race versus kind of race versus culture, maybe, in the sense that you're talking about Black as a whole race versus the context of race, ethnicity. So like being Black British, rather than just being like me, I'm Nigerian. That's a bit more specific, but that's my ethnicity versus my other ethnic. Well, I don't know if I could say that's my other ethnicity because I'm mostly Nigerian. I say mostly because I did a test and I'm like 86, 89 maybe.
Okay,
but I'm basically like African. But yeah, no. Yeah, I would say so, because the culture that we have produced as being Black British people is something that it's not something that's completely new, but it's not something that can be put in any one group. It's a hybrid of the things, of the experiences that we have had, of the cultures that we have brought to represent. And it's just like the best of everything for us. So like when it comes to, what's a good example? When it comes to British slang, for example, like it's become there's certain terms in British slang that have become synonymous with, this is something that you can expect to say to a Black British person. But if you were to use it in another particular context, you may feel uncomfortable for doing so. So like you may not feel 100% comfortable for speaking to 100% British people that way, unless they're kind of, how can I say, like, unless they're like white allies, or they're just like like white people who are very comfortable in the Black space, and not just very comfortable, but they have a respect for the people and they have respect for the culture, and that's because of that they I would say assimilate quite well on the surface. But then also you have like particular terms that if you were to now go back and try and use it in the traditional cultural setting that it was used in, you may find that it's not exactly how you presented it, or it's been adapted to fit that culture.
Sure. Yeah, and I think even on that note, it's also interesting how some of those words traverse across the Black diaspora as well. So you also get within like Black Canadians that use some of the same slang that Black British people use, or even Black Australian people use. But I guess it's because they all share some common roots or common denominators.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in your 86% Nigerianness. What is the rest?
Damn. So basically, like last year, I think it was last year, like March, I did what was it? 93? No, sorry, 26. 26 and me. Let me even check.
23 and me, yeah.
23 and me. That's it. Why did I get that so wrong? 23 and me.
Can you say 96?
I said 96. Like I haven't done science since GCSEs, so the chromosomes on me. That was very wild. But anyways, I did that like last year, and then the results came back, and like I found out that I was 80 something percent Nigerian, and what was it? Oh, like, wait, hold on. I'm just read. So I had to sign in.
But off the top of your head, what were?
Yeah,
Do you remember like one or two of the other ones?
part Ghanaian, part Sierra Leonean, part Cameroonian. But like most of West Africa was lit up, and I found that
Yeah.
quite interesting because when I first came to university, people had looked at me and they had said that yeah, you can't be Nigerian, and for some reason that like confused me because am I not looking? Do I not look like the traditional like Nigerian? But then it
Mm.
also goes in my head, what does a traditional Nigerian look like? Because
Yeah.
there are people with different, I would say different ethnicities, but different tribes who define what who have like different definitions of what Nigerian looks like to them, or
Mm.
what the average Nigerian looks like to them. And then you even have people in the Yoruba tribe, which is I wouldn't say the main tribe because I don't want to get in trouble, but like one of the main tribes or one of the biggest tribes in Nigeria that you have so many different people who look different and you could never point to anyone and say, yeah, this is what we expect from the standard Nigerian. But I'd say something that pushed people like pushed this kind of ethnic diversity that people used to ascribe to me. And what I mean by that is just like let me even rephrase what I just said. This whole thing of me not looking like a Nigerian came about mostly because of my hair, and I think the average Nigerian person, their hair is supposed to be like 4C. And as I grew my hair out, like it was discovered to be a bit more curly, or like to have a bit like to have a lot less looser curls, so like 4B, 4A. And you wouldn't get that with the quote unquote traditional Nigerian. And I feel like that is more so to do with my genes, even though both of my parents are traditionally Yoruba, traditionally from even the same state, from where you could expect like traditional Yoruba Nigerians to come from. So I think there's there's something interesting about even having diversity within someone's culture or someone's tribe even before they are uprooted and planted into a different culture or a hybrid culture.
Yeah. I think you've touched on a really interesting point, and it just makes me think about like what is there's just a big fallacy with assuming that there is such a thing as someone that looks Nigerian, because
Mm,
Nigeria as a concept is a made up thing. And I think this is what I wanted
mm,
to touch on as well, is
mm,
just all of these things are made up things. And it's really interesting how we have these definitions of, obviously there are cultural, you know,
mm,
similarities and homogeneities that have developed now that you have a state that's called Nigeria, and it's been there for
mhm,
what, 50, 60 years, however many years.
mhm,
And so I think there are cultural similarities, there are cultural aspects that lots of people will share. A lot of those might also be linked to, I guess, the tribe and the aspects of the culture that you're from.
mhm,
But I find it really interesting how we have this strong nationalism, and this was something that JJ Bolo touched on the podcast interview we did as well,
mhm,
is just the fact that, you know, even the fact that you, like you said, you have all these other parts that could technically be part of your identity because you have genes or part of your background that's from other countries within Africa, but you
mhm.
strongly identify as a Nigerian,
Yeah.
even though Nigeria is a colonial construct. And all of these African countries are colonial constructs. And I don't just say that to be, you know, academic or whatever, but just from the fact that, like, when you look at the map of Africa and how the tribes go, most of the tribes go horizontally, like across, particularly across Western Africa towards Central Africa. Whereas
Mhm,
the way the maps on the lines on the maps are drawn vertically. So that's how the states are split. So you
mhm,
have all of these states, and it's so interesting how it's very similar in lots of different states. in Nigeria, as in Ghana, as in Togo, as in Benin, as in lots of places, you have the north, even in Sudan, the north, which is Muslim, which is a majority of a certain ethnic group. Then in the south, you have people from different ethnic groups, or the southeast, or wherever. And so, even if you look across part of Western Africa, so I'm Igbo as an example, Igbo in Nigeria, but you also have Igbo people that are in Togo and some in Cameroon. And similarly, you have Yoruba people throughout that cross section of West Africa that goes horizontally, but not vertically. And similarly, you have the Fulani people who are present in northern Nigeria, but present in the north of lots of other West African countries, all the way through to East Africa. There's Fulani people there because Fulani people are a nomadic people. And so it's interesting how we have this nationalism and pride in these countries that were kind of made up, and made up in a way that was not intended to be constructive. They were made up in a way that would be easy to manage by colonial forces. You know, they created these countries, they created these borders in a way that would be easiest for them to manage people. That's really what it was about. Manage people and also divide resources. They were not thinking about, oh, how can we instill the most cultural pride? How can we make sure that, you know, there's a really, this mixing pot of people is really going to work. It's going to be successful. They're going to be economically vibrant. Nobody was thinking any of that. Those are things that we have to impute posthumously. We have to pretend that that was always the intention. And now we're thinking, oh, how can we make sure that Nigeria is successful as a country, or lots of other African countries? And I think that's also why you'll see that as soon as the British or other colonial forces left, so many of these countries had civil wars within a few years, because those people, these groups of people, were not ever living together until the countries were formed in the way that they were. And so that's why I also find it interesting being in the diaspora now. So being in the UK as an example, I think there's lots of people that are having this kind of Pan-African renaissance where everyone wants to discover their roots and everyone's connecting themselves to different countries and different places. But it's interesting how much of that, just as we were saying, is illusory. Like, how much does it really make sense? If, you know, you want to get in touch with being Nigerian or whatever, and I don't want to say that we should just devolve to tribalism and you should just say that you're only Yoruba or you're only this or that. But I think it's also just accepting the reality of Pan-Africanism is also that the same Yoruba that you are is the same Yoruba, or, you know, historically, as people in Benin or in Togo, or perhaps even other places across Africa. And so even in Cameroon, you have people that have names that are similar to Yoruba names, the same in Congo. So even throughout Central Africa, you have the same as well. So you have all these migratory patterns from people during colonial times and pre-colonial times as well. So I think that's one thing that I find really interesting, and something that we should think about more in terms of how we identify as Africans, or how we identify with Africa and with concepts of Africa and what it means to be African. How do you understand your Africanness? Half the time we're just fighting about jollof recipes and things like that.
That's a
But
joke. Is it not? Is it not? Is it not
do you
just
have an
a joke?
opinion?
Yeah, not like not even on the rice thing, because you know what, everyone can, like, if there's food on the table, like, you can't complain at the end of the day. Like, I feel like at the end of the day, it's just banter between countries. It's not like we're gonna.
Yeah, no, of course, it's not real fighting. But what I mean is, I just find it interesting how also on Twitter, for example, someone will put up a picture of, I don't know, whatever people call it. In Nigeria, you would say it's puff puff, but in other countries across Africa, they call it different things. And then you have people that are getting really intense. People start calling each other names because they're not recognizing that in my culture, this thing is called this. And it's like, you know, before the British and the French came and started planting flags in your country, these were all the same people eating the same food. But now that, you know, your language, even the way that you speak in Nigeria, as an example, we're now speaking Pidgin English. That's not what we were speaking before they came. The same with African countries where they're speaking Creole and things like that, or that, you know, they're speaking mixes of maybe a native language and something else.
Mm,
And so we have a lot of these debates and other things that come up
mm,
where we forget that underneath it all, many of these people are the same people.
mm.
So that's one thing I find interesting anyway.
Yeah, I feel like that's quite that's an interesting point to touch on, because it's almost like, I would say, the same, like a similar form of intolerance that that members of the white race, or just like white people in general, have with black British people, is the same intolerant is a similar form of intolerance that black British people, or actually, yeah, I mean, I'll speak from my perspective as a black British person. I've observed an intolerance of particular black British people to not identify with other black British people, even though you have more in common with each other than you would realize. Like the whole point that you're making about people cussing each other out because they're not giving the right name for, or they're not quote unquote giving the right name for a particular sort of food. Like, you've grown up in this world thinking that things are set one way, and rather than
Mm,
accepting the challenge, or kind of expanding your worldview, you're saying everything that I know has to fit in this concept of you have to, everything that I know outside of what I know, or I am yet to know, has to fit inside what I currently know. Otherwise I'm gonna reject it. And that's interesting enough, a lot of what white people do, because, and not to get onto white supremacy and everything, but like, because they have such a wider pool of what they can accept, and what they know, anytime something challenges that, they attack it. And not only do they attack it, but they don't they don't bear the negative consequences of doing as such all the time
mm,
in this system. Like, and the system often protects people who do that, whereas with black British people, you don't get that protection for being intolerant. You will get slandered, and like, people that you won't have that community to come and defend you. Some people will even fragment, and the friends that you had that aren't as intolerant may even come and slander you as well for being intolerant.
yeah.
I feel like that was a
But I
big
think
picture that I just built up.
it's interesting how all of these effects just come out of, I guess, people being split, and then now you end up fighting between yourselves about different things, and there's different political
Mm,
aspects, there's different cultural aspects of, things that people have disagreements about or misunderstandings about. And then I think you also have a lot of situations where people grow up with certain prejudices against people from certain places because, oh, your
mm,
parents said this about, let's say, Jamaican people, or about people that are from Congo,
mm,
or this and that. And so that's also something that I see play out a lot as well.
mm. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Well, that's been an interesting development, possibly in the last generation or so. Another thing that I could that could be pointed out is just the positive implications of this of these like hybrid cultures popping up, is that where people may fight across by the differences, they are encouraged in their similarities. So, like, for example, people may for even using the same examples, people may feel like it's easier to communicate just for the fact that they share the same language, or they can speak to each other, or just like, what's a really good example is like, if I'm walking down the street and I see another black guy. That guy could be any ethnicity. I don't. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what ethnicity he is. He's black. I am black.
Mm,
We're both in this British place. If I nod to him, he'll nod back. If he nods to me, I'll nod back. We know it's cool. And
yeah.
because of those similarities we have, it's like, I could essentially use that to maybe start a conversation if we're on a really good day. If we're like, oh, so it's a nice day, isn't it? And then suddenly we can bridge the gap between between two cultures because we have that similarity, which is something that has developed from Black British culture.
Yeah, it's almost like a shared aspects of a new language or ways of communicating, particularly as minorities within this society, I guess. And that
Mm.
is also part of slang. It's part of, you know, a lot of the ways that we communicate with each other. And that traverses to like non-verbal things as well. It's interesting. I was watching this I can't remember if it was a documentary or if someone was just talking about the history of like where the DAP came from, and they were saying it's
Oh.
about like the soldiers that were in the war, like the black soldiers. They used it
Mm.
to communicate secret messages about things that were happening, etc., etc. I don't know if that's the true origin, but it's interesting again how a lot of these things proliferate and spread throughout cultures.
Mm. Mm.
But I'm
That's
also
good.
interested in, I guess, the topic of identity more generally and how we decide who we are.
Mm.
Because in the same way that I guess deciding that, for example, you want to strongly identify as Nigerian above other things, I think there's
Mm.
also other ways that we identify ourselves, which lead to, I don't know if I would call it like self-reinforcing things, but by
Mm.
virtue of accepting a certain aspect of your identity or asserting a certain aspect of your identity, you
Mm.
then end up developing things that align with that because you want to reinforce that to yourself that this is who you are and this is what you do.
So like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like you believe in an aspect of your you believe in an aspect of your identity so much so that it is reinforced by the things that develop, but these things only develop from that belief.
Yeah, to an extent. I think it goes both ways. So sometimes you're intentionally reinforcing it
Mm.
because you know, may I'll give you a good example actually. So for example, my dad grew up during the war in Nigeria, the Biafra
Mm.
war, and so he told me the stories about some of his experiences growing up and all of those things. And that has caused me to develop some affinity with, you know, the struggles of Igbo people from that time, or
Mm.
the cause of, or the struggle for what Biafra was intended to be. That's not to say I'm some kind of secessionist or whatever today,
Yeah.
but it's to say that I now have affinity with those things. And so I will look to reinforce that identity by looking for more information, looking to bolster that in different ways, rather
Okay.
than accepting maybe other parts of my identity more. But I would say I'm still split between them. But I think
Mm.
similarly, it's something I've written about in the newsletter as well, how people will earmark themselves by certain characteristics they have. So, for example, someone will say, "Oh, I have insomnia, or I have this, or I have that, or this is
Mm.
just what I'm like." And that's not to say that they're not like that or they don't have those things, but I also think that very often by labeling yourself as that characteristic, by
Mm.
virtue of that characteristic, oh, I am a short-tempered person, instead of you are just a person who loses their temper or uses losing their temper as a shortcut to be able to get what they want. That's
Mm.
not necessarily intrinsically who you are as a person. That is the identity that you've accepted, and now you curate the rest of your experiences around the fact that you've decided this is what you're like. And so
Mm.
similarly, I think there was a study with people had insomnia, but there's also a lot of other studies that I wrote about as well, which were
Mm.
to do with the placebo effects and things like that. And those were super interesting. I remember there was one which was about allergies, and I think it was looking at people that were allergic to poison ivy. And so they lined up all these people and they rubbed them with a leaf on each arm. And
Mm.
with some of them, they rubbed their left arm and they said, "This is poison ivy." And then they rubbed their right arm and they were like, "Oh, this one's completely harmless. It's not poison ivy." And with one group, when they said they were rubbing their left hand with poison ivy, it was poison ivy. With the other group, it wasn't, and it was flipped. It was the other way around. But
Yeah.
these are all people that actually are supposedly allergic to poison ivy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty sure it was there were only 3 people that actually reacted to the poison ivy when they were told that it was harmless.
Wow.
So when they thought they were just being rubbed with some harmless thing, on one hand, remember that they're being rubbed on both arms. So
Mm-hmm.
on one arm, you're being told this is poison ivy. On
Mm-hmm.
that arm, you'll develop rashes, even though the thing that they rubbed on you was not poison ivy.
Mm-hmm.
On your other arm, they're telling you, oh, this is completely harmless, but actually they're rubbing you with poison ivy, and you
Yeah.
develop no allergic reaction.
Yeah.
And so you get things like that that happen on a physiological level as well, which is super interesting, where I guess because you've accepted a certain element of your identity as you are someone that has this allergy or you are someone that has this thing. And this is not to denounce all allergies and say that you should go and eat peanuts if you have a peanut allergy. That's not what I'm saying. But I find it interesting how there's studies that show that, there are a lot of things that have real impacts in our lives, but
Mm.
it's kind of self-prescribed in a way, or self-reinforced, I should say, not self-prescribed, because those people did have an allergy to poison ivy, but it
Mm.
was very much reaffirmed by them knowing that they've been touched by poison ivy. If
Yeah.
they didn't know that they were touched by poison ivy, they might not have reacted in that way. Or if they were told
Mm.
it was harmless, they might not have reacted in that way.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I get the point you're making. The thing that literally came into mind as you were making that point, just to develop it a little bit further, is that um I guess we one thing as like Black British people, or kind of, yeah, living in this hybrid culture, living with hybrid identities, is that we have a lot more freedom of choice as to what we define ourselves to be. And like that has like positive and negative consequences. The positive consequence, sorry, flies, the positive consequence of this fly won't die. And then the small ones as well. The positive consequence of that freedom is that we have more to say, we have more choice over the beliefs that we can reinforce. And I guess, like, literally, if we were to be more conscious about the beliefs, the things that we feed ourselves, not to say that this is how I'll just become a millionaire like a year, but there are things that you can reinforce that out of the best of both of your identities, the best of being in a British environment, but then also the best parts of you actually being a Nigerian, you can actually reinforce. And I think, I don't know if that's like a form of natural selection, of which will suddenly get passed down to my kids. But I would like to think that that I develop habits and abilities and beliefs that you know they would appreciate and maybe choose if it benefits them. I guess possibly one of the negative consequences of this freedom would one of the main consequences is just feeling like you have to be all of these things at the same time, or you have to be standing on
Mm.
one side, or just kind of the exposure to too much choice, and you feel like you have to decide, and you there's a limited time for you to be able to decide, and once you step on one side, you're there forever. um I think the world that we're living in, it's becoming so clear that there's a lot of things that aren't black and white. And you know what? Identity is one of those things. You can't say I can't say that I am completely Nigerian, because if that was true, then all of these beliefs that I would have now should kind of resonate with, let's say, the average Nigerian. Like if I was to be able, if I was like 100% like I would, if I was 100% like culturally Nigerian, I should say, then I guess by virtue of that fact, I could be thrown in the Nigerian environment, and or the average Nigerian environment, and expected to act like an average Nigerian. But I have beliefs that correspond to the environment that I'm in, the British culture that I've been exposed to as well. So yeah, I don't know if I don't know if you get the
But I
point that I
think
was making throughout the whole point.
I think I do to an extent. Another thing I
Mm,
wanted to bring up is also the extent to which we live out, I guess, the stories that we're told or the narratives that we're given. So, for
mm,
example, part of yours, even it might be that you were told that, oh, because you've grown up in Britain and because you have some of these different characteristics, now you can't survive in Nigeria. Whereas perhaps if you just went on a whim without the rest of that narrative,
Yeah.
you know, you might have had more faith in your ability to survive and to do well. But I think some of these things, it's not just something that you're conscious of. These are things that actually impact you, whether you're thinking about them intentionally or not.
Mm.
And I think there's loads more studies or examples that I can think of. As an example, I was writing about the mass like psychosomatic illnesses, so kind of like mass hysteria illnesses, and there's been several examples. The funniest one was there was something called like a dancing flu in the early, yeah, in I think the 14th and 17th centuries in Europe. And
Mm-hmm.
it was, yeah, it's the dancing plague. And basically hundreds of people would suddenly start dancing, but to the point where they collapsed and some people died. And it was not
Wow.
a intentional or voluntary thing. And I know it might have seemed like I've strayed very much from what we were talking about before, but the point that I'm making is that I'm really interested in the effects of, I think there's narratives that accompany certain groups. Oh, because you're Caribbean or you're West Indian, these are how West Indian people behave. And not just that it's your own people telling you that, but also people in society telling you that, or people telling you it could be on one level just because you're black, this is what black people are like, this is what we expect of black people. On another level, it could also be related to your culture or your religious group. This is what people are like, this is how people behave, and this is what we expect of you. And that can be
Mm-hmm.
positive and also negative. So when you have negative stereotypes that are attached to certain groups, people can
Mm-hmm.
end up acting out those stereotypes unwittingly, just because that's
Mm-hmm.
what they are and have been conditioned to believe.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's interesting how, just from a psychological or biological perspective, you see how these quote unquote placebo effects can affect people en masse, where lots of people can start suddenly believing something even when it's not true. There was one example, I think it was also somewhere in Europe, where there was this bug in a factory. Over 60 workers started having like severe nausea, breaking out their skin. They were just in complete tatters, having to be sent home. And then they sent like virologists and scientists to come and look at like what's going on. What is this terrible virus that's attacking all these people? And there was literally nothing. It was just, I don't, you can't say who started it or where it started from, but it's interesting how by believing that there is something that is going to happen that is negative, as an example,
Mm-hmm.
those things just manifest in your body. Like you will start exhibiting the physical symptoms of that disease, even when there was no disease. And again, I don't want people to take this out of context. I'm not going to say this applies to COVID or to anything else, but I, but I am saying these are things I find interesting, because then that can also tie into, for example, you know, when we talk about how different groups succeed in the UK, whether it's like Nigerian people or some West Indian people, you have these narratives about how well certain groups do and how well
Mm-hmm.
you might be expected to do if you're from a certain group. And then on the flip side, you also have narratives about how you might be doomed to fail simply by virtue of being black or simply by virtue of being from a particular background. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing I'm really interested in, the extent to which those things are just naturally occurring and just the circumstance, and how
Mm-hmm.
much of it is actually genuinely reinforced by an unwitting self belief that you've been told this is what happens and this is how things go. And you see examples of this is how things go, and then you just act that out, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
That's so interesting because if you think about it, a lot of some people use these negative stereotypes as motivation to be like, yeah, but not all people are like this. And yet, when you get to a level where you have succeeded in where you have succeeded in disproving the existence of the stereotype, by by the case study of your own life, you may sometimes feel like you're out of place because you have a society, you have people who expect you to fit in a stereotype that you have spent your whole life you spent your whole life trying to prove that you weren't. And so I guess that not maybe not so clear cut, this whole idea that black men may perform, may be like lazy, for example, or they may not perform as well, or they're expected to be less productive in the workplace. But like that we have black people who have been able to go to workplaces which may not be so diverse, connect with people to advance up the ranks, and yet they suffer with imposter syndrome because it's like you're not surrounded by evidence immediately that these negative stereotypes aren't so true for the whole of society, but you've just done it with your own life, and that's the only example that you may have on hand.
Yeah. I also think that a lot of stereotypes can be very damaging to your natural resilience as well. And so you have
Mm,
circumstances where um when something bad happens, because maybe you've been conditioned, and again, it's not say, oh, we blame everything on racism, but if something happens, there might be a higher tendency that, okay, instead of just thinking of this thing in isolation and trying to bounce back from it, you are then recalling this narrative, which to a very large extent is actually true, but you're
mm,
recalling this narrative of how you are being set up to fail and opportunities are not going to be afforded to you. And if it's hard, it's just going to get harder. And so you have a lot of people that almost opt out or self-select out of opportunities and self-select out of whether it's applying for higher education or aspiring to certain industries, because for them, when they have some of these negative experiences, they are attaching it to this narrative that they believe is true about the wider world universally, because those
mm,
things are true. But I think because we have these narratives, we also lose sight of the nuance and the variety. So, as much as it may be true that, yes, okay, black people in the UK will have very high incarceration rates, let's say, as an example, or you have very high, you're at, I think the last statistic I saw was that if you're a black graduate, you're 4 times more likely to be unemployed after you graduate than your white
wow,
peers. Let's put that as an example. If that's a
wow.
narrative that you have internalized, even if you don't believe it to be true,
Mm,
when anything happens that reaffirms or confirms that narrative,
mhm,
you it grows in significance in your mind. So
mm,
as you encounter, and that's why racism is a great example of this, because is it true that every single person is racist? No. Is every
mm,
institution racist? Possibly not. But there's a narrative that exists, and you will definitely encounter racism. And so as you encounter lots more of these individual circumstances, it's
mm,
almost like the specter builds in your head that tells you, actually, because of all of these things, I'm not going to be able to achieve what I want to achieve.
mm,
And so while it is true that you've had all these experiences that you've had, it's also not necessarily the case that it was always going to be that way, if you
mm,
get what I mean. And so there's a lot of people that maybe have self-defeating ideas about their role in society or the opportunities that are available to them as a
mm,
consequence of the negative, maybe stereotypes and narratives that are attributed to the identity that they have.
mm. That's really interesting. And I guess we always come back to like racism, but I guess we are talking about this whole black British topic where it's like it's quite interesting to see how it can have an impact on people, even when they continue to challenge the system, or when they when they may not believe the things that are presented. Um, I feel like one of the positives of social media is that you're just exposed to a community that's bigger than, you know, your immediate circle. So you have these connections, you have these case studies, you have these examples, and it's so, I guess to an extent, I would lean on the side that it's easier to it's easier to no, yeah, it's harder to not, it's harder to be gaslighted, or to be presented with a stereotype that doesn't fit a lot of these case studies that you may have in front of you. So the like using the example that you've been given, that you have given in terms of black graduates being 4 times less likely to be unemployed. You may have you may be surrounded, or you may have followed a lot of people who you may perceive to be ambitious, and despite these conditions, despite that statistic, you see all of them some way or another finding a way to get a job, or finding a way to be employment within their first year of being out of university. Being in that environment um doesn't guarantee that that same thing is going to happen for you, but it makes it more likely that, you know, you can defeat that narrative before it even takes root. And I guess it comes to what you surround yourself with, what's in your environment. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of this whole Black British thing, because even though we are Black, being in Britain has transformed us. So even though we may be susceptible to these stereotypes, the environment, the people that we put ourselves around, the information that we put ourselves around, the information that we absorb is also important in our transformation and in our growth.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. Maybe I should leave it there. I won't try and one up you. Okay, sweet. Anyway, thanks for everyone for tuning in.